The sun was a hammer, and the land was the anvil. It beat down on Jesse Callahan's hat, the heat so thick it felt like a blanket woven from shimmering air and dust. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Cinder, plodded onward, its head low, its breath a dry huff in the vast, aching silence. This was a country that had long since given up on God. The plains stretched out like a hide tanned by a merciless fire. Cracked and scarred by dry creek beds, mesquite and sagebrush clung to the earth like desperate old men, their roots clawing for a drop of water that was only a memory. Here and there, the white gleam of bone broke the monotony of brown and gray, the skull of a steer, the ribs of a coyote, all picked clean and bleached by the relentless sun. It was a land of endings, and Jesse Callahan felt right at home in it. He rode alone, a ghost on a tired horse, following a rumor. Rumors were like water in this desert. You took what you could get, even if it tasted of alkali and lies. This one had come from a half-dead prospector in a dusty town 2 weeks back, whispered through cracked lips in exchange for a canteen of water. A preacher, the old man had croaked. A man named Brother Gideon traveled the territories with a wagon painted with scripture. He preached salvation but practiced something else entirely. He collected fallen women, promising them a new life in the Lord's grace. But the prospector had seen the look in their eyes. They were hollowed out, their souls scraped clean, their bodies treated like chattel. They were slaves, hidden behind a veneer of piety. Jesse had heard stories like it before. In a lawless land, evil often wore the most convincing masks. He wasn't a lawman. Not anymore. He wasn't a hero either. He was just a man with a long memory and a debt he could never repay, a debt written in ash and smoke, and paid for every night when he closed his eyes and heard his wife, Sarah, scream his name one last time. So he rode, not toward justice, but toward a balancing of the scales. It was the only thing that quieted the ghosts. He found the wagon near dusk, pulled over in the shadow of a rock formation that looked like a jawbone full of broken teeth. It was a simple covered wagon, but the canvas sides were painted with verses from Leviticus in stark, black letters. 2 men were tending a fire, their faces grimy with trail dust and self-satisfaction. A third, a big, broad-shouldered man with a vacant stare, stood guard near the back of the wagon, a shotgun cradled in his arms. There was no sign of a preacher. Jesse dismounted 100 yards out, the soft thud of his boots swallowed by the dirt. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man who had learned that noise was a luxury you couldn't afford in the wild. He drew the Colt from his hip, the metal warm against his palm. An old and familiar friend. "Evening," Jesse said, his voice a low rasp. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife. The 2 men at the fire jumped, hands flying toward their own guns. The big man near the wagon turned, lifting the shotgun. "State your business, stranger." One of the men at the fire barked. He was thin and weaselly, with eyes that darted like nervous insects. "Heard the preacher was in need of a new hand," Jesse said, his eyes never leaving the man with the shotgun. "Came to offer my services." The weaselly man relaxed a little, a sneer twisting his lips. "Brother Gideon ain't hiring. Now move along before you find trouble you ain't looking for." Jesse took another slow step forward. "The trouble I'm looking for has to do with what you're hauling in that wagon." The big man's knuckles whitened on the shotgun. The air grew tight, stretched thin like a drumhead. From inside the wagon came a faint sound, a rustle of movement, then silence. "That's church business," the second man at the fire said. He was stockier, with a beard stained by tobacco juice. "And the Lord's business ain't yours." "The Lord left this part of the country a long time ago," Jesse said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "Now, I'm going to ask you one time. Open the back of that wagon." The weaselly man spat into the fire. "Go to hell!" The world exploded in a concussion of noise and smoke. The big man's shotgun blast went wide, tearing a chunk out of a nearby cactus. Jesse's Colt answered twice. The first shot took the big man in the chest, punching him backward against the wagon wheel. his face a mask of shock. The second shot caught the weaselly man in the shoulder as he fumbled for his pistol. He screamed and crumpled to the ground, clutching the wound. The tobacco-stained man stared, frozen for a heartbeat, his eyes wide with disbelief. That heartbeat was all Jesse needed. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, the barrel of his Colt coming up to press hard under the man's chin. The man smelled of fear and unwashed clothes. "Drop it," Jesse ordered. The man's pistol clattered into the dust. "Now open it." Jesse nodded toward the wagon, trembling. The man stumbled to the back of the wagon and fumbled with the latch on the heavy wooden door that had been fitted over the canvas opening. It swung open with a groan. For a moment, all Jesse could see was darkness. Then, a figure emerged, stepping slowly into the fading light. She was not what he expected. She was young, maybe 20, with dark, tangled hair that fell over her shoulders. Her dress was plain and torn at the sleeve, her face smudged with dirt. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they burned with a cold, defiant fire. There was no fear in them, only hate. She looked at the man Jesse had killed, then at the one groaning on the ground, and finally at Jesse himself. Her gaze was unnervingly steady.
"Are you all right, ma'am?"
Jesse asked, his voice softer than before. She said nothing. She simply stared at him, her chin lifted, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Jesse turned his attention back to the man he held captive. "Get on your horse, take your friend and ride. Tell your preacher that Jesse Callahan is coming for him. Tell him I'm going to send him straight to the devil he pretends to serve." The man scrambled to obey, hauling his wounded companion onto a horse and fleeing into the deepening twilight, leaving a trail of dust and curses behind them. The dead man lay still by the wagon wheel, a silent testament to the evening's bloody work. Jesse holstered his Colt and turned back to the woman. "You're free now." She gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Free?" She looked around at the desolate landscape, the endless stretch of sand and rock. "You call this free? I've just traded one cage for another, one master for a different one." Jesse felt a flicker of irritation, but he tamped it down. He understood the language of cages. He lived in one himself, a prison built of memory and regret. He walked over to Cinder, untied a water skin and a canvas sack from his saddle. He set them on the ground a few feet away from her. "There's water in the skin," he said, his tone even. "And enough jerky and hardtack in the sack to last a few days. The next town is 2 days' ride east. You should be safe enough if you keep moving." He didn't wait for a reply. He swung himself up onto Cinder's back, gathered the reins, and rode away from the wagon, from the dead man, and from the woman with the storm in her eyes. He did not look back. He had done what he came to do. She was no longer his concern. He made his camp a few miles away, a small fire of mesquite wood that burned with more smoke than heat. He sat with his back against his saddle, sipping coffee from a tin cup. The familiar bitterness a comfort in the cold desert night. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the black sky like chips of ice. He stared up at them, but he did not see them. He saw a homestead burning against a night sky just like this one. He saw flames licking at the roof of the small cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. And he heard the sound that had split his world in 2, Sarah's scream. He had been in town, selling a few pelts, delayed by a lame horse. He'd ridden back under a full moon, humming a tune she liked, a foolish, happy man. He'd smelled the smoke from a mile away and had spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, his heart pounding a panicked rhythm against his ribs. But he was too late, always too late. The cabin was a skeleton of charred timbers, the barn a pile of smoldering ash. They had taken everything, the raiders who had swept through the valley, and they had taken her. He found her later, in the woods. Her scream was the last sound she had ever made, and he had not been there to hear it, not in time to stop it. That failure was a brand on his soul, a wound that never healed. He had hunted the men down, one by one, but vengeance was a hollow victory. It did not bring her back. It did not silence the scream. A faint sound pulled him from the memory, the crunch of a boot on gravel. He was on his feet in an instant, the Colt in his hand, his body coiled and ready. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, a silhouette against the darkness. It was the woman. She had walked all this way, following the faint glow of his fire. She held the waterskin and the canvas sack he had given her. She did not speak. She simply walked to the other side of the fire and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared into the flames, her face a mask of exhaustion. Jesse slowly lowered his gun and sat back down. He did not ask why she had come. He did not ask her name. In the vast, lonely wilderness, sometimes the presence of another soul was enough. Words were unnecessary baggage. He poured what was left of his coffee into his cup and held it out to her across the fire. She looked at the cup, then at his face, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Her touch was cold. They sat that way for hours, two strangers bound by a moment of violence, sharing a silent vigil under the indifferent stars. Her name, he would learn days later, was Alma. They traveled together after that, though no agreement was ever made. She simply packed up her few belongings in the morning and was ready to go when he saddled Cinder. He gave her the preacher's horse, a scrawny mare that looked as broken as she did. For days, they moved across the landscape in a cocoon of silence. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the wind. He learned about her in small, stolen glances. He saw the way she rode, ramrod straight, as if expecting a blow from behind. He saw the way she ate, quickly and without enjoyment, as if she feared the food would be snatched away. One afternoon, when they stopped at a small, muddy creek, she rolled up the sleeves of her dress to wash her face and arms. Jesse saw the scars then, faint, white lines that circled her wrists, the ghost of old bindings. Later, as she reached to adjust the pack on her horse, her dress shifted, and he saw a glimpse of her back. It was a roadmap of pain, crisscrossed with older, thicker scars that spoke of a cruelty he did not want to imagine. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Her story was her own, a heavy burden she carried in the silence. He would not try to lift it from her. He respected her right to her own ghosts. They were headed for Perdition Gulch, a town that lived up to its name, a festering sore on the face of the territory. It was a place Jesse had unfinished business. A man named Sheriff Mark Redden lived there, a man who had once been his friend, a man who had stood by and let Sarah's killers ride away because they were powerful men with money and influence. Jesse was going to have a conversation with Redden. It was a conversation that was 5 years overdue. The silence between them was not always heavy. Sometimes it was comfortable, a shared space free of expectations. He would brew coffee in the morning, strong and black, and would hand her the first cup without a word. She would find a patch of wild onions and add them to the salted pork he cooked for dinner, giving the bland meal a sharp, welcome flavor. They developed a rhythm, a partnership forged without language. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind began to howl, picking up sand and grit, whipping it into a blinding frenzy, a dust storm. Jesse grabbed Alma's arm, his grip firm but not rough. "This way!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. He pulled her toward a shallow ravine, and they huddled together against the rock face, shielding their faces with their arms as the world disappeared into a swirling brown cloud. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the air was thick with choking dust. They were pressed close together, his shoulder against hers, the shared warmth a small anchor in the chaos. He could feel the slight tremor in her body, but she made no sound. They stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, two small figures against the rage of the elements. When the wind finally died down and the air began to clear, they pulled away, their faces and clothes covered in a fine layer of grit. Her stormy eyes met his for a moment, and in them, he saw not gratitude, but a flicker of something else, a shared understanding. They had weathered the storm together. They reached the outskirts of a small, dusty settlement, a day's ride from Perdition Gulch. It was little more than a collection of rough-hewn shacks, a general store, and a saloon whose sign, "The Thirsty Devil," swung on one rusty hinge.
"We'll get supplies here,"
Jesse said, breaking the silence of the entire day.
"and a hot meal, if we're lucky."
The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and sweat. A few hard-looking men sat at tables, nursing drinks and eyeing the newcomers with suspicion. Jesse led Alma to a small table in the corner, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. He was always aware, always watching. He ordered whiskey for himself and asked Alma what she wanted.
"Just water,"
she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. The word hung in the air between them, the first she had spoken to him in over a week. As they waited, a large, beefy man with a red, bloated face and a stained shirt detached himself from the bar and lumbered toward their table. He was drunk, his movements clumsy, his eyes glazed with cheap liquor and malice. He stopped beside Alma, looming over her.
"Well now, look what we got here,"
he slurred, a foul grin spreading across his face.
"Ain't seen a pretty thing like you in this dive before. Why you sittin' with this gloomy bastard? A sweet little flower like you ought to be sittin' with a real man."
He reached out a grimy hand to touch her hair. Before his fingers could make contact, Jesse's hand shot out and clamped around the man's wrist like a steel trap.
"She's not interested,"
Jesse said, his voice dangerously low. "Move on." The drunk tried to pull his arm away, but Jesse's grip was unbreakable. The man's face contorted with a mixture of pain and rage. "Let go of me, you son of a—" He never finished the sentence. With a flick of his wrist, Jesse twisted the man's arm, forcing him to his knees with a cry of pain.
"I said,"
Jesse repeated, his eyes like chips of flint. "Move on." He released the man, who scrambled backward, cradling his wrist and cursing. Jesse turned back to the table, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened.
"But something had—"
Alma was on her feet. In her hand, she held a small, silver-plated derringer that had appeared as if from nowhere. It was pointed directly at the drunk's chest. Her hand was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shake, but her aim was steady. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. Her eyes, however, were on fire. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a survivor, of someone who had been pushed to the edge and had found something hard and unforgiving there. She was terrifying and magnificent all at once. The saloon fell silent. The drunk stared at the small, deadly pistol, his bravado draining away, replaced by a sober fear.
"Get out,"
Alma said. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was low and clear and carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears and a reservoir of untapped rage. "Get out before I send you to meet your maker." The man needed no further encouragement. He stumbled out of the saloon, disappearing into the dusty street, slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds. Alma lowered the derringer. Her whole body was shaking now, a storm of adrenaline and memory crashing through her. She sank back into her chair, her breathing ragged. She did not look at Jesse. She just stared at the tabletop, her hands clenched around the small gun, her knuckles white. Jesse watched her, a newfound respect dawning in his weary soul. This woman, this silent, scarred creature, was no damsel in need of rescuing. She carried her own weapons, both seen and unseen. She had walked through a hell of her own making and had come out the other side with a spine of steel, for the first time since his wife had died. Jesse Callahan felt something other than the cold weight of the past. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something damn close to it. It was kinship. Perdition Gulch was not so much a town as a wound on the landscape, festering under the sun. Wooden storefronts with false fronts leaned against each other like tired drunks, their paint peeled away to reveal the raw, splintered wood beneath. The single dusty street was a river of mud in the wet season and a bed of choking powder in the dry. It was a place people came to disappear, to outrun a past, or to profit from the misery of others. For Jesse Callahan, it was a place to face a ghost. He reined Cinder to a halt in front of the sheriff's office, a squat building with barred windows that looked more like a cage than a bastion of justice. He swung down from the saddle, his movements stiff from the long ride. He told Alma to wait, his voice low and flat. She watched him, her face impassive, but her hands were clenched tightly on the reins of her mare. She had seen the look in his eyes when he'd first said the name of the town. It was the look of a man marching toward his own gallows. Jesse pushed open the door without knocking. The air inside was stale, smelling of stale cigar smoke and old paper. A man sat behind a large oak desk, his feet propped up, a silver star pinned crookedly to his sweat-stained vest. He had grown soft in the intervening years, his face jowly and his middle thick, but Jesse would have recognized him anywhere. Mark Redden. Redden's feet hit the floor with a thud. The friendly smile he had been about to offer a potential constituent died on his lips, replaced by a look of wary recognition, then dread. "Callahan," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I don't suppose God has much to do with this town, Mark," Jesse said, his voice as dry as the dust on his boots. He didn't move from the doorway, letting the harsh sunlight frame him, turning him into a dark, accusing silhouette. "Or you?" Redden swallowed hard, his hand inching toward the pistol on his desk. "Don't," Jesse said, and the single word was colder than a winter wind. Redden's hand froze. "What do you want, Jesse? The past is the past. There's nothing left to say." "5 years ago, you told me you'd find the men who did it," Jesse said, his voice deceptively calm. "You told me you'd see them hang. You gave me your word." "I tried," Redden said, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "You know I did, but they were Wade Voss's men. He owns half this territory. There were no witnesses. My hands were tied." "You were my friend," Jesse said, and the words were like stones dropped into a deep well. "You stood by my wife's grave and you lied to my face." "It wasn't a lie," Redden insisted, his voice rising with a desperate edge. I couldn't. A man has to know which fights he can win. I have a family, a position to maintain." Jesse stared at him, his face a mask of cold contempt. He saw not a man who had made a difficult choice, but a coward who had sold his soul for a tin star and a comfortable life. The rage that had simmered inside him for 5 years was a cold, hard thing now, too deep for shouting. Silence was his only weapon. Finally, he spoke. "You're right. There's nothing left to say." He turned to leave. "Jesse, wait!" Redden called out, a note of panic in his voice. "You can't stay here. Voss has eyes everywhere. If he knows you're in town, he'll see it as a threat. For your own good, you need to ride out and don't come back." Jesse paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. "You worrying about my good, Mark, or yours?" He stepped back out into the blinding sun, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving the sheriff to stew in his own fear. He walked back to Alma, his face grim. "We're staying a few days." He led their horses to the livery, then walked her to the town's only boarding house, a 2-story building that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. He paid the proprietor, a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Gable, for a room for Alma for 1 week. He paid in advance. "Just for the lady?" Mrs. Gable asked, her sharp eyes flicking from Jesse's worn duster to Alma's silent form. "Just for her," Jesse confirmed. He handed Alma the key. "Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She took the key, her fingers brushing his. She looked at him, a question in her stormy eyes. He was putting a wall between them, a physical distance to match the emotional one he so carefully maintained. He thought he was protecting her, but to Alma, who had known so many cages, a locked room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. He left her there, on the porch of the boarding house, and walked away without another word. Alma's room was small and clean, but the silence pressed in on her. The restlessness that had been her constant companion on the trail grew sharper within the four walls. She felt like a wolf pacing a trap. She could hear the sounds of the town through the thin glass of her window, the raucous laughter from the saloon, the rumble of a freight wagon, the sharp words of an argument. It was a town humming with a current of unseen danger. In the evenings, she would sit by the window, watching the street below. She heard the whispers from the other boarders, from women gossiping over the fence in the backyard. They spoke of the saloon, the Golden Garter, and the girls who worked there. They spoke in hushed tones of women who looked like her, dark-haired and quiet, who sometimes arrived in town and then, just as quietly, disappeared. They were last seen at the Golden Garter, usually in the company of men who worked for the railroad or for the powerful rancher, Wade Voss. The whispers always ended there, with a shrug and a nervous glance over the shoulder. No one asked questions in Perdition Gulch. Jesse found a cheap cot in a room above the livery stable, a place that smelled of hay and horse sweat. It suited him. He had no need for comfort. Sleep was not a friend to him, but an enemy that ambushed him with memories. He would lie awake for hours, the ghosts of his past swirling in the darkness. But now, a new image joined them, Alma's face, her eyes filled with that defiant fire. He told himself he was a fool. He had rescued her, and that was the end of it. He had no room in his life for another person, another weakness. His heart was a barren piece of ground, salted and burned, where nothing could grow. To care for her would be to put her in the path of the violence that followed him like a shadow. So he fought it. He tried to build a wall of indifference around the thought of her. But every night, his feet would carry him from his cot, out into the darkened street. He would find a place in the shadows across from the boarding house, and he would watch her window. He would stay there until the faint light from her lamp went out, a silent, solitary guardian. He watched her sleep from afar, a man condemned to protect what he refused to let himself possess. One night, the light in her window stayed on longer than usual. He saw her silhouette pacing back and forth, a restless shadow trapped in a box of light. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He crossed the street, his boots silent in the dust, and climbed the stairs to the porch of the boarding house. He knocked softly on her door. It opened a crack, the key still in the lock. He could see one of her eyes, wide and wary. "It's me," he said. She opened the door and stepped back, letting him in. She was fully dressed, the silver derringer lying on the small table beside her bed. "Couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a question. "Me neither," he admitted. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the small room, a man out of place. The air was thick with unspoken things. She went back to the window, staring out at the dark street. "I was sold," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. She didn't turn to look at him. She just kept staring out the window, as if speaking to the night itself. "When I was 16, my uncle, he had a gambling problem. He owed a man a lot of money. The man saw me, and he told my uncle the debt would be forgiven." Jesse stood frozen, the words hanging in the air like razor blades. He had seen the scars, but hearing the story behind them was like taking a punch to the gut. "He took me with him," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion, a flat recitation of a story she had told herself 1,000 times. "He said I had a debt to pay, a sin to atone for, my uncle's sin, but I was the one who had to pay for it." She finally turned to face him, her eyes burning with a cold, dry light. "The preacher, Brother Gideon, He was the same kind of man. He found girls like me, girls who had been used up and thrown away. He promised us salvation, but it was just another kind of cage. He said our sins were a stain on our souls, but what he called sin, I called survival. Jessie felt a profound and terrible connection to her pain. He knew what it was to be branded by the actions of others, to carry a weight that was not yours to bear. You survived, he said, the words feeling inadequate, but they were the only ones he had. That's all that matters. She gave a small, sad shake of her head. You survive, but you're never the same. You carry the cage with you, even when the door is open. He had no answer for that. He knew it to be true. The next day, Jessie rode out to the edge of town, needing the open space to clear his head. He came upon a small, hardscrabble farm, a patch of irrigated green in a sea of brown. A family was standing beside a scorched field of corn, their meager crop destroyed. A handful of rough-looking men on horseback were laughing, their saddles branded with the emblem of the Transcontinental Railroad. An old Mexican farmer, his face a roadmap of sun and worry, was pleading with them. Please, senor, this is all we have. My family. This land belongs to the railroad now. Old man. The leader of the group sneered. We have the papers. You have until tomorrow to clear out. But the court has not decided, the farmer began. We are the court, the man said, and he spurred his horse forward, trampling what was left of the family's small vegetable garden. Something in Jessie snapped. It was the casual cruelty, the arrogance of the strong preying on the weak. It was the story of his life, the story of this whole damn country. He urged Cinder forward, placing himself between the railroad men and the farmer's family. That's far enough, Jessie said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. The leader turned his sneer on Jessie. And who the hell are you? Get out of the way before you get hurt. His name is Santiago, Jessie said, nodding toward the farmer. And this is his land. Now ride out. The railroad man laughed. You in what army? Cowboy? Jessie didn't draw his gun. He simply sat on his horse, his hand resting on his thigh, and stared at the man. His gaze was steady and unnervingly calm. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, and it was more intimidating than any weapon. The railroad men exchanged uneasy glances. They were bullies, not fighters. They weren't getting paid enough to die over a patch of dirt. This ain't over, the leader snarled. But he gathered his men and they rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and threats in their wake. Santiago rushed forward, his eyes full of tears. Gracias, senor, gracias. You did not have to do this. A man has to stand for something, Jessie said, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew he hadn't solved the farmer's problem. He had only delayed it. Alma had followed him out of town, curious and worried. She had watched the entire exchange from a distance. She saw the way Jessie had put himself on the line for total strangers, risking his life without a moment's hesitation. It touched a part of her she thought had died long ago. Here was a man who lived by a code, a fierce and unyielding sense of justice that the world had tried and failed to beat out of him. But she also saw the deep well of sadness in him. He could save a farmer's land, but he couldn't save himself. His rigid code of honor was also his prison, a constant reminder of the one time it had failed, the one person he had not been able to protect. She felt a surge of frustration, not at him, but for him. She wanted to shake him, to tell him that he was allowed to lay down his armor, that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. That night, Jessie went to the Golden Garter. He wasn't looking for a drink. He was looking for information and trouble. He found both. The railroad men were there, licking their wounds with whiskey. When they saw him, their drunken courage returned. The fight was short, brutal, and one-sided. 4 of them cornered him near the back of the saloon. Jessie moved with a grim efficiency, his fists like hammers, but they were 4 to his 1. A chair crashed over his back. A boot caught him hard in the ribs, sending a blinding flash of pain through his side. He heard a crack, felt something give. He fought through the pain, a cold fury guiding his movements, until all 4 men were unconscious or groaning on the floorboards. He stood over them, breathing heavily, his side a screaming agony. He had won the fight, but it had cost him. He stumbled out into the night, leaning against the wall of the saloon, trying to draw a breath that didn't feel like a knife in his chest. He made his way slowly, painfully, toward the boarding house. He didn't know where else to go. He managed to climb the stairs and knock on her door before his legs gave out. When she opened it, he half collapsed against the frame, his face pale with pain. Alma's eyes widened, and without a word, she pulled him inside, helping him to the bed. "You're a fool, Jesse Callahan," she whispered, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. "Heard that before." He grunted, wincing as he tried to sit up. "Your shirt," she said. "Take it off." He tried, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his ribs. His hands fell uselessly to his sides. Alma hesitated for only a second. Then, her hands, surprisingly gentle, went to the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers were trembling. She worked the buttons free, her knuckles brushing against his skin. She pulled the sweat-soaked fabric away, revealing a massive, dark bruise already forming on his side. His chest was a landscape of old scars, but this new injury was angry and raw. She ran a gentle hand over the bruised area, her touch light as a feather. He flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. For a long moment, they stayed that way, her hand on his broken body. The air in the small room charged with a raw, unspoken vulnerability. He was a man made of iron and leather and regret, and here he was, broken and bleeding in her room, allowing her to see the weakness beneath the armor. He looked at her, at the genuine fear and concern in her stormy eyes, and he felt a sudden, sharp panic. He could not let her in. He could not let her try to fix him. He was beyond fixing. "You don't have to save me," he whispered, his voice raspy with pain. Alma looked down at him, her trembling hand still resting on his chest. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his cheek. "Too late," she whispered back. The next morning, as Alma was leaving the general store with bandages and liniment, she saw a small crowd gathered around the sheriff's office. A man was nailing a fresh piece of paper to the notice board. She pushed her way through the onlookers to see what it was. Her blood ran cold. It was a wanted poster. The ink was still fresh, the sketch a crude but recognizable likeness of the man in her room. Below the drawing, in stark black letters, were the words, "Wanted Jesse Callahan for murder and robbery, $500 dead or alive." The betrayal was a physical blow. The men he had once hunted, his old allies in a war that had cost him everything, had now put a price on his head. The ghosts of his past were no longer content to haunt his dreams. They were coming for him, and they would not stop until he was in the ground. And she, by some cruel twist of fate, was standing right beside him. The news hit Jesse like a physical blow. Alma found him in the livery, methodically checking the cinch on Cinder's saddle, his movements a familiar ritual of preparation. She held out the poster, her hand steady, but her eyes were a maelstrom of fear and fury. He took it from her, his gaze scanning the crude drawing, the stark, damning words. A muscle twitched in his jaw. $500. That was the price of his life, set by the very men he had once trusted. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. "Wade Voss," Jesse said, his voice a low growl. The name felt like poison on his tongue. He never could stand to leave a job unfinished. "What do we do?" Alma asked, her voice tight. Jesse crumpled the poster in his fist. "We ride now." His instinct, sharp and honed by years of survival, screamed at him to protect her by leaving her behind. He could give her his money, tell her to take a stagecoach east, to find a new life where the name Jesse Callahan was nothing but a whisper. It was the right thing to do, the safe thing. He turned to her, the words forming on his lips, but they died when he saw her face. The defiant fire was back in her eyes, brighter and hotter than ever.
"I am not staying here. Jesse,"
she said, her voice cutting through his thoughts.
"do not even think it.
You think I am just something you can leave behind when it gets difficult? Some baggage to be discarded?
This is not your fight. Alma—"
"You made it my fight when you pulled me out of that wagon," she retorted, stepping closer. "You made it my fight when you stood up for that farmer. You made it my fight when you stumbled to my door, bleeding. I am not some fragile doll you can hide in a drawer. I ride with you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken woman from the preacher's wagon, but a warrior forged in her own private hell. She had a strength that humbled him. To leave her now would not be to protect her. It would be to deny her, to insult the very steel he had come to admire. "Get your things," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "We leave in 5 minutes." They slipped out of Perdition Gulch like ghosts in the dead of night. They didn't take the main road but cut through the back alleys, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft dirt. A dog barked, a sharp, frantic sound in the oppressive silence. Then came a shout from the street, followed by the pop of a rifle. The hunt had already begun. Jesse spurred Cinder into a gallop, and Alma was right beside him, her small mare straining to keep pace. They rode hard, leaving the festering town behind them, plunging into the vast, dark wilderness of the Badlands. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, offering little light to guide them. They rode by instinct, Jesse's internal compass guiding them toward the broken, rugged country to the north, a maze of canyons and ravines where a man could disappear if he was smart, or die if he was not. Alma rode with a rifle Jesse had taken from the livery laid across her lap. It was too heavy for her, the stock awkward against her saddle. She gripped it with a ferocity that made her knuckles ache, her palms rubbing raw against the rough wood. The jarring rhythm of the gallop sent jolts of pain through Jesse's broken ribs with every stride. But he pushed it down, locking it away in the iron box where he kept all his pain. Fear was a luxury. Survival was the only currency that mattered now. Alma held on, the rifle a grim promise that she would not be helpless again. She refused to let him fight alone. They rode until the horses were lathered and gasping, then slowed to a walk, letting them pick their way through a treacherous landscape of sharp rocks and thorny brush. Behind them, in the far distance, they could see the faint, flickering lights of torches. A posse. Sheriff Redden, no doubt bought and paid for by Wade Voss, had deputized every bounty hunter and trigger-happy drunk in town. For 2 days, they pushed onward, stopping only for brief rests, eating jerky and hardtack in the saddle. The pursuit was relentless. They were being herded, driven deeper into the wilderness. On the 3rd night, the sky, which had been a clear, merciless blue, turned a bruised and angry purple. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an unseen energy. A low rumble echoed in the distance. "A storm is coming," Jesse said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to find cover." They found it in a narrow opening at the base of a rock wall, a dark slash in the stone almost hidden by a thicket of overgrown sagebrush. It was a cave, not deep, but it would shield them from the coming deluge. They led the horses inside, the animals whickering nervously as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The storm broke with a primal fury. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by a crash of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. Inside the cave, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the brief, terrifying flashes of light from outside. Jesse sat with his back against the rock wall, his rifle across his knees. Every nerve on edge, he could hear Alma's breathing, quick and shallow. With each clap of thunder, she flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Another bolt of lightning lit the cave, and in that stark white flash, he saw her face, It was a mask of sheer terror. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, and she was staring at the unyielding rock walls as if they were closing in on her. "Alma," he said, his voice low. She didn't seem to hear him. She was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that racked her entire body. She wrapped her arms around herself, her knuckles white. "I cannot breathe," she gasped, her voice a strangled whisper. "The walls, it is so dark." The next clap of thunder was directly overhead. A deafening explosion of sound. Alma cried out, a raw, terrified sound that was torn from the deepest part of her soul. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rear of the cave, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. Jesse moved toward her in the darkness, his hands out in front of him. "Alma, it is just a storm. We are safe in here." "No," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Not safe. The dark. He locked me in the cellar. For days, no light, no food. I could hear the rats scratching. I thought I would die in that blackness." Her words tumbled out, fragmented and broken. The story of the cellar she had mentioned once before, now given a voice by the terror of the storm. The cave had become her prison, the thunder the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. She was not in the Badlands anymore. She was back in that dark, airless place, a 16-year-old girl waiting to die. A wave of protectiveness, so fierce and powerful it staggered him, washed over Jesse. He reached out and gathered her into his arms, pulling her away from the back wall. She struggled for a moment, a wild, trapped animal, then collapsed against his chest, her sobs shaking both of them. He held her tight, his hand stroking her tangled hair. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, surrounding her with his warmth, his presence. "I have got you, Alma," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he did not recognize. "Right here. You are not in that dark place anymore. I will not let you be. You are safe now." And for the first time in 5 long years, as he spoke the words, he felt the truth of them resonate in his own hollow chest. In that moment, protecting her was the only thing in the world that mattered. He meant it. They stayed that way until the storm passed, and the first gray light of dawn crept into the mouth of the cave. She had cried herself to sleep in his arms, her exhausted body finally surrendering to the safety he offered. He had not slept at all. He had simply held her, a silent sentinel against the darkness, both outside and within. The posse had lost their trail in the storm, but Jesse knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They moved on, climbing higher into the hills, the terrain growing more rugged and treacherous. They found a small spring and refilled their canteens, the clear, cold water a gift in the harsh landscape. It was there that the bounty hunters found them. There were 3 of them, appearing suddenly on the ridge above, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. "Nowhere left to run! Callahan!" one of them shouted. The first shot kicked up dirt at Cinder's feet. Jesse reacted instantly, shoving Alma behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay down," he commanded. He drew his Colt, firing back at the men on the ridge, the shots echoing through the hills, but he was outgunned and exposed. Another bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head, showering him with stone fragments. He needed to move, to find better cover, to draw their fire away from Alma. He saw a narrow ravine a few yards to his left. It would provide some protection. "I am going to draw their fire," he yelled to Alma. "When I do, you run. Take my horse and ride north. Do not stop." "No!" she screamed back, her face pale with terror. "I am not leaving you." "Go!" he roared, and he broke from cover, firing as he ran toward the ravine. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his duster. Another whizzed past his ear. He felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left shoulder, as if he had been struck by a branding iron. The impact spun him around, and he fell hard, his head hitting the unforgiving ground. The world dissolved into a gray, fuzzy haze. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Alma scream his name. When he came to, the shooting had stopped. Alma was kneeling over him, her hands pressing down hard on his shoulder, her face streaked with tears and dirt.
"Jesse!"
She sobbed.
"Oh God, Jesse!"
He gritted his teeth, pushing himself up on one elbow. "The bounty hunters?" "They are gone," she said. I think they thought you were dead. They were arguing. One of them wanted to come down and make sure, but the others were afraid it was a trap. They rode off." He looked at his shoulder. His shirt was soaked with blood, a dark, spreading stain. "The bullet is still in there," he said, the words strained. Alma's face hardened, the fear replaced by a grim resolve. "We have to get it out." She helped him to his feet and supported him as they stumbled through the hills, searching for shelter. They found it an hour later, a small, abandoned line cabin, tucked away in a grove of aspens. It was little more than a single room with a leaking roof and a dirt floor, but it was a sanctuary. She eased him onto the rickety cot that was the cabin's only furniture. She built a small fire in the stone hearth, her movements quick and efficient. She boiled water in his tin coffee pot. Then she came to him, his own hunting knife in her hand, the blade glinting in the firelight. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, biting down hard on a piece of leather she handed him. The pain was excruciating as she probed the wound, her hands surprisingly steady. He felt the cold steel of the knife, the searing agony as she cut, the slickness of his own blood. He focused on her face, on the fierce concentration in her eyes, and used it as an anchor in the sea of pain. He heard a small, metallic clink as the slug dropped into a tin plate. Then she was stitching the wound closed with a needle and thread from her small sewing kit, her movements precise and sure. She had done this before. The thought was a chilling one. For the next few days, Jesse drifted in and out of a feverish haze. He was vaguely aware of Alma tending to him, bathing his face with a cool cloth, forcing broth and water between his lips. He was haunted by nightmares, the familiar ones of fire and smoke. But now they were twisted, with Alma's face superimposed over his wife's, her screams mingling with Sarah's. In his moments of lucidity, he would find her sitting by his cot, her face etched with exhaustion, her eyes never leaving him. She was haunted, too, by the terrifying fear of losing him just as she was learning what it meant to love someone, to keep herself awake, to keep the silence and the fear at bay. She talked. She whispered stories to him in the long, dark hours of the night, stories of the girl she once was, before her life had been stolen from her. She spoke of a childhood in a green valley, of chasing fireflies in the summer dusk, of the smell of her mother's baking, of a time when her heart was whole and her spirit was free. She was giving him the pieces of herself, the memories she had kept locked away, offering them up as a prayer for his survival. Slowly, the fever broke. He began to heal. The pain in his shoulder subsided to a dull ache. He was weak, but he was alive. One afternoon, he was sitting up, propped against the cabin wall, watching her mend his torn duster. "You are a terrible nurse," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Your bedside manner is appalling." She looked up, a small, startled smile touching her lips. "And you are a terrible patient. You complain more than a constipated bear." He let out a weak chuckle, which turned into a genuine laugh, the first he could remember in years. The sound was rusty and unfamiliar, but it was real. Her smile widened, and she laughed with him, a clear, beautiful sound that filled the small, dusty cabin with a warmth he had thought he would never feel again. The laughter died down, leaving a comfortable silence in its wake. He looked at her, at the way the sunlight from the small window caught the stray strands of her dark hair, at the soft curve of her mouth, at the deep, stormy intelligence in her eyes. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart crumbled to dust. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second, He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but one of slow, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of shared pain, and of a fragile, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances. When they broke apart, the air was thick with all the things they had never said. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, he told her everything. He told her about Sarah, about the life they had built and the dreams they had shared. He told her about the raid, about his failure to be there, about the all-consuming vengeance that had driven him for 5 years. He spoke of the vast, empty hole inside him, a wound far deeper than the one in his shoulder. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting on his. When he was finished, his voice raw with the telling, she did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply held his hand and looked at him with an understanding that went beyond pity. Her presence, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in the man he was, did not magically fill the hole that Sarah's death had left, but it did something else. It began to stitch the ragged edges of the wound together. She was not a replacement for what he had lost. She was the reason to start rebuilding. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. He was outside, testing the strength in his arm, when he heard the crackle of flames. He turned to see smoke pouring from the roof of the cabin. The bounty hunters had found them again. Alma burst out of the cabin, coughing, a look of terror on her face. A man on horseback emerged from the trees, a lit torch in his hand. He grinned, a cruel, triumphant expression on his face.
Nowhere to run this time. Callahan!
Before the man could react, Jesse's Colt was in his hand. A single shot, clean and true, knocked the man from his saddle. But there were others. 2 more riders broke from the cover of the trees, firing wildly. Jesse pushed Alma behind him, returning fire. But the cabin was already an inferno. Their sanctuary turned into a funeral pyre. He saw the remaining bounty hunters exchange a look. Then they spurred their horses and disappeared back into the woods, leaving the fire and their dead companion behind. They knew he was wounded. They would be back. He stood in the dying light, watching the last embers of their sanctuary hiss and fade into the twilight. The smell of defeat and scorched pine hung heavy in the air. Everything they had touched, every small moment of peace they had carved out of this unforgiving wilderness, had been turned to ash. He looked at Alma. She was staring at the charred remains of the cabin, her face smudged with soot, her expression a mixture of grief and a hard, cold fury that mirrored his own. In that moment, something inside Jesse Callahan shifted. The years of running, of reacting, of being hunted like an animal, coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. He was tired of it. He was tired of the ghosts of his past dictating the terms of his future. He was tired of the fear he saw in Alma's eyes, a fear that existed only because of him. Wade Voss and his men were not just a threat, they were a disease, and they would continue to poison everything he touched until he cut them out for good. He was a ghost, haunted by the living, and it was time to put them in the ground.
It ends now,
he said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a death sentence. Alma turned to him, her eyes searching his. What do you mean? I am going after them, he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, where the last of the sunlight bled from the sky. Voss, and every last man who rides with him. This does not end until they are all gone. A cold dread washed over Alma's face, quickly replaced by a stubborn resolve. Then we go after them. Jesse shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. No, not we, me. He turned to face her fully, his expression unyielding. This is my ending, Alma, not yours. I am going to give you Cinder, and all the money I have. You will ride east, and you will not look back. You will find a town where no one knows your name, and you will start over. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He did not expect the raw fury that flashed in her eyes. She took a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides.
You fool! She spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You magnificent, stubborn fool! Do you still not see? There is no me and you anymore. There is only us. You do not get to make this decision for me. You do not get to decide what I can endure."
"I will not lead you to your death," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is a fight I do not expect to walk away from. I will not have your blood on my hands."
"My blood is my own," she shot back. "So is my life. You taught me how to fight. Jesse, you taught me not to look away. And now you are telling me to run and hide while you go off to die? No."
"This is not a discussion. Alma, it is a decision," he said, his voice hard as iron, trying to force her away with the sheer weight of his will. "You are staying here." Her hand moved so fast he didn't see it coming. The sharp sting of her slap echoed in the sudden silence between them. His head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming on his cheek. He stared at her, stunned, more by the pain in her eyes than the sting on his face. Before he could speak, she surged forward, grabbing the front of his shirt with both hands and pulling his face down to hers. She kissed him, hard and fierce. It was not the tender kiss from the cabin. This was a kiss of desperation, of anger, of a love so profound it bordered on madness. It was a brand, a promise, a desperate, defiant claim on his very soul. She broke away, breathless, her forehead resting against his chest. Her tears finally came, hot and silent, soaking into his shirt. "You listen to me, Jesse Callahan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You go and you do what you have to do. You face your demons, but you do not die. Do you hear me? You do not die, because if you do, I will find you. If you die, I will find your body and I will bury you myself. I will not let you lie forgotten in some unmarked grave. I will find you." He stood there, his cheek smarting, his lips still burning from her kiss, and felt the last of his defenses wash away. He could not argue with that kind of love. He could not fight a loyalty that promised to follow him even into death. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his aching ribs. And for a long moment, they just stood there, two broken people clinging to each other in the ruins of their temporary home. He left her at dawn with the scrawny mare and most of their supplies. She did not cry when he rode away. She simply stood with the rifle in her hands, watching him go, her face a mask of grim determination. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that he had not seen the last of her. He rode Cinder hard, pushing the buckskin through the rugged country, following the tracks of the two bounty hunters. They were sloppy, confident that their work was done, that he was either dead or dying. They led him on a direct path back toward their masters. He traveled light and fast, living off the land, his senses sharpened by a singular, cold purpose. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, throbbing reminder of what was at stake. The trail led him to a place that looked like the jawbone of a corpse, a burned-out mining town nestled in a high, desolate canyon. The skeletal remains of a head frame stood sentinel over a collection of collapsed buildings and caved-in mine shafts. The wind moaned through the empty window frames, a mournful sound that spoke of broken dreams and forgotten lives. It was a place of ghosts, a fitting hideout for men who dealt in death. He left Cinder tethered in a ravine a mile away and approached the town on foot as dusk began to bleed across the sky. He moved like a phantom, using the shadows and the ruined structures for cover. He counted 7 men. They had set up camp in the one building that was still mostly intact, the old assayer's office. A fire burned in the hearth, its light spilling out into the growing darkness. They were drinking, their rough laughter echoing through the ghost town. Jesse did not charge in. Vengeance was a dish best served cold, and his had been on ice for 5 years. He was wounded, and he was 1 man against 7. He would have to use the terrain, the darkness, and their own arrogance against them. He would be the ghost they never saw coming. He waited until the moon was high and the laughter from the assayer's office had grown loud and sloppy with whiskey. The first man he took was a sentry, a young kid who was more interested in sneaking a drink from a flask than watching the shadows. Jesse came up behind him, a whisper in the dark, a hand over the mouth, the cold steel of a knife, and it was over before the kid even knew he was in a fight. One down. He crept closer to the assayer's office. Two more men stumbled out, arguing about a card game. They were headed for the dilapidated saloon across the street, likely to settle their dispute with their fists. Jesse let them go, melting back into the shadows of a collapsed blacksmith shop. He watched them enter the saloon, their lantern casting long, dancing shadows. He circled around to the back, slipping through a rotten wall where the planks had fallen away. The inside of the saloon smelled of dust and decay. The two men were at the bar, shoving each other. Jesse picked up a heavy iron pry bar from the floor. He stepped out from behind the bar as one of them turned. The man's eyes widened in shock, but the pry bar swung in a silent, brutal arc, and he crumpled without a sound. The second man spun around, reaching for his gun, but Jesse was already on him. The fight was short and savage, ending with the man's head hitting the corner of the bar with a sickening crack. 3 down. He made his way back to the assayer's office. The noise from inside was quieter now. He peered through a grimy window. 2 men were asleep in their bedrolls, passed out from the whiskey. A third was sitting at a table, cleaning his rifle, and in the corner, staring into the fire, was Wade Voss. Jesse kicked the door in. The man at the table looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. He dropped his rifle and clawed for the pistol at his hip, but Jesse's Colt was already speaking. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man was thrown backward, a red flower blooming on his chest. The 2 sleeping men jerked awake, fumbling for their weapons, but they were groggy and slow. 2 more shots, and they slumped back into a sleep from which they would never wake. 6 down. And then there was 1. Wade Voss rose slowly to his feet. He was older than Jesse remembered, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were the same, cold, pale, and utterly devoid of mercy. He held a bottle of whiskey in one hand, and he showed no fear. "Callahan," he said, his voice a low drawl. "I had a feeling you were too mean to die." "You should have made sure," Jesse said, his Colt steady in his hand, pointed directly at Voss's heart. Voss took a slow sip from the bottle, his eyes never leaving Jesse's. "So, you finally came. Took you long enough. Come to get your justice." "Jesse, is that it? You think killing me makes you a righteous man? You think it brings your pretty little wife back from the dead?" The taunt was meant to unnerve him, to make his hands shake, but Jesse's rage was a cold, solid thing now, and glacier in his soul. "This is not about justice, Wade. This is about finishing things." "Finishing things?" Voss chuckled, a humorless sound. "You and I, we were the same. Jesse, we took what we wanted. The only difference is, I never pretended to be anything other than what I am. You always had to wrap yourself up in a flag of honor, but when it came down to it, you were just as savage as the rest of us. Your wife, she saw that in you, didn't she? Right at the end." A red haze threatened to cloud Jesse's vision. Voss was trying to poison the memory of Sarah, to twist his grief into a weapon against him. A steady rain began to fall outside, a soft, mournful drumming on the roof. "It was just business. Jesse," Voss continued, taking another step forward. "That ranch of yours was on land the railroad wanted. You wouldn't sell, so we were paid to persuade you. She just got in the way, nothing personal." Jesse's finger tightened on the trigger. He saw it then, the flicker in Voss's eyes. He was stalling, his right hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving behind his back. Jesse fired. The bullet struck the whiskey bottle in Voss's hand, shattering it, sending glass and liquor spraying across the room. Voss grunted in pain, but he used the moment of distraction to lunge forward, a long, wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was faster than Jesse expected. The knife sliced through Jesse's coat, and he felt a searing pain in his side. He stumbled back, firing again, but the shot went wide. Voss was on him, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. They crashed to the floor, wrestling for control of the gun, of the knife. It was a primal, ugly struggle. Jesse's wounded shoulder screamed in protest. His broken ribs felt like they were on fire. Voss was strong, fueled by a cornered animal's desperation. The knife came up again, aimed at Jesse's throat. Jesse managed to get his hand up, grabbing Voss's wrist, the sharp edge of the blade slicing into his palm. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jesse twisted, bringing the barrel of his Colt up and pressing it against Voss's ribs. He pulled the trigger. The sound was muffled, the effect devastating. Voss's body went rigid, a look of final, ultimate surprise on his face. The fight went out of him, and he collapsed on top of Jesse. A dead weight. Jesse shoved the body off him, gasping for breath, the room spinning around him. He struggled to his feet, clutching his side. Blood was pouring from a deep stab wound, warm and sticky against his fingers. He stumbled out of the office, out into the cold, cleansing rain. He took a few steps into the muddy street, and then his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward into the mud, the rain washing over him, mingling with the blood that was draining the life from his body. The world grew dark at the edges, the sound of the rain fading to a distant roar. He heard a sound, faint at first, then closer. A horse, moving at a frantic pace. A voice, screaming his name. Through the haze of pain and encroaching darkness, he saw a figure running toward him, slipping and sliding in the mud. Alma. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him. He saw the tears streaming down her face, cutting clean paths through the grime. She had followed him. She had tracked his trail, just as he had taught her, just as she had promised she would.
No,
She sobbed, a keening sound, torn from the depths of her soul.
no, 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 Jesse, look at me, stay with me.
She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, oblivious to the mud and the blood. "You promised," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You promised you would not die. Do not leave me. Please, Jesse, do not leave me alone again." He tried to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came from his lips. He was so cold. He could feel himself slipping away, the last of his strength draining into the thirsty ground. She somehow got him to his feet, or rather, she got herself under him, her small frame taking his weight as she half dragged, half carried him out of the street, away from the dead. They found shelter in a dilapidated barn at the edge of the ghost town. The roof leaked, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, but it was out of the rain. She eased him down onto a pile of old, musty hay, her movements frantic and desperate. He lay there, looking up at her, his vision blurring. He could feel the last of his fight ebbing away. He had done it, he had finished it, but the victory felt hollow, a bitter ash in his mouth. He looked at her face, at the love and terror warring in her eyes, and he knew that his vengeance had cost him the only thing that had made his life worth living again. He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. "You are the only thing," he whispered, his voice a faint, ragged breath, "that ever made me stop running." A sob escaped her lips. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, her tears falling onto his face. "You will find heaven in my arms," she whispered back, her voice a fierce, desperate prayer against the storm. "Just hold on, just hold on." He did not die. He clung to life with a grim, stubborn tenacity that Alma matched with her own. For days, he lay in the musty hay of the abandoned barn, his life a flickering candle she refused to let the wind blow out. She cleaned and dressed the deep stab wound in his side, the gash in his shoulder, the slice across his palm. She hunted for them, bringing back a scrawny rabbit that she made into a thin, nourishing broth. She foraged for roots and herbs, using the knowledge of the land he had taught her to keep his fever down. She was no longer just his companion. She was his anchor to the world of the living. When he was finally strong enough to stand, leaning heavily on her, he looked out from the barn at the ghost town, at the assayer's office where 7 men now lay dead. The rain had washed the blood from the street, but it could not wash the weariness from his soul. His quest for vengeance was over. The ghosts were buried, but he felt no triumph, only a vast, aching emptiness. He had won his war, but he had almost lost himself. "There's a place I heard of once," he said to her one morning, his voice still weak. "A valley, high in the northern mountains. They say the law does not reach that far, a place for people who want to be left alone." "Is it safe?" she asked. "Nowhere is safe," he answered honestly, "but it is free. Freedom." The word hung in the air between them, a concept as beautiful and as fragile as a butterfly's wing. It was what she had craved in the preacher's wagon, what he had sought at the bottom of a whiskey bottle and the end of a gun barrel. It was the one thing they both needed more than air itself. And so, they decided to disappear. They gathered what little they had, their horses, their weapons, a few supplies scavenged from the outlaws' camp, and turned their backs on the ghost town. They rode north, leaving the blood-soaked badlands and the memories they held behind them. Jesse rode slowly, his body still a landscape of pain, but for the first time in years, he was not running from something. He was riding towards someone. Their journey was slow, marked by the rhythm of his healing. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It was not the heavy, awkward silence of 2 strangers, but the comfortable, deep silence of 2 people who understood each other without the need for words. He would watch her as she brushed her hair in the firelight, and he would feel a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the flames. She would watch him as he stared at the horizon, and she would see not a killer, but a man struggling to find his way back to the light. After 2 weeks of travel, they came to a town called Redemption. It was a small, quiet place, nestled in a river valley, a collection of neat houses and freshly painted storefronts. It seemed a world away from the grit and grime of Perdition Gulch. It was a place that offered the promise of its name, but Jesse Callahan knew that the ugliest sins were often hidden behind the prettiest faces. They needed supplies, a real bed for a night, a brief respite from the trail. Jesse's wound still ached, and Alma was weary to the bone. They took a room at the local hotel, and as Jesse negotiated with the clerk, Alma stood by the window, looking out at the main street. And then she saw it, a sight that made the blood freeze in her veins. A wagon was pulling up in front of the saloon, a gaudily painted affair with the words, "Madame Evangeline's Emporium of Earthly Delights," emblazoned on the side. A portly man with a florid face and a silk vest climbed down, then turned to help a girl from the wagon. She could not have been more than 15. She was beautiful, with wide, terrified eyes and hair the color of corn silk. She clutched a small, pathetic bundle of belongings to her chest, and she had a look on her face that Alma knew as well as she knew her own reflection. It was the hollowed-out look of a trapped animal, the look of a soul that had already surrendered. The portly man put a proprietary hand on the small of the girl's back and guided her toward the swinging doors of the saloon. Alma felt the air leave her lungs. The quiet street, the neat houses, the peaceful facade of the town. It all dissolved. She was 16 again, standing beside her uncle, the world shrinking to the leering face of the man who had just bought her. Jesse came to stand beside her, holding a room key. "What is it?" he asked, seeing the look on her face.
"That girl,"
Alma whispered, her voice shaking.
She is like I was."
Jesse's gaze followed hers to the saloon. His face hardened. He saw the wagon, the man, The girl, and he understood immediately. It was the same story, a different town, a different verse in the same sad, ugly song. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He put a hand on Alma's arm. "Come on," he said, his voice low and firm. "Let's go. This is not our town, not our business." He was thinking only of her, of the valley, of the peace that was almost within their grasp. He could not fight every battle, right every wrong. His only duty now was to her, to keep her safe. But Alma did not move. She pulled her arm away from his grasp and turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire he had never seen before. "Not our business?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Jesse, look at me. Look at what I was when you found me. A piece of property, a thing to be used and discarded. That girl is walking into the same cage I just escaped. And you want to ride on?" "Alma, we cannot save the whole world," he said, his voice pleading. "We are so close. We can be free." "What good is our freedom if we buy it with her slavery?" she shot back, her voice rising. "What good is that valley if we have to look over our shoulder for the rest of our lives? Knowing we left her to that fate? We would not be free. We would be cowards." She took a step closer, her gaze pinning him in place. "You were the one who taught me this. Jesse, you stood up for that farmer. You faced down those men in the saloon. You taught me not to look away." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was using his own code, his own past actions, as a weapon against his weariness. He looked into her eyes and saw not just a plea for help, but a demand for the man he had once been, the man she believed him still to be. And in that moment, he knew she was right. To ride away now would be to betray not just the girl, but Alma, and the very foundation of the fragile new life they were trying to build. He had spent years atoning for a failure to save one person. He could not live with himself if he willingly created another. He let out a long, slow breath, the last of his resistance draining away. "All right," he said. "What do you have in mind?" A plan began to form. A risky and audacious scheme born of their shared experiences. It was not a plan of brute force, but of cunning. They spent the rest of the day observing, learning. The saloon, the Emporium, was owned by the sheriff's brother, a man named Silas Croft. The sheriff, a hard-faced man named Elias Croft, turned a blind eye to his brother's business, which was little more than a thinly disguised brothel, trapping young women with false promises and crushing debt. That evening, Alma put on her plainest dress, tied her hair back, and walked into the Golden Garter. She told Madame Evangeline, a woman with a painted face and eyes as hard as pebbles, that she was alone and looking for work. She played the part of the desperate, broken woman perfectly, because it was a part she knew by heart. She was hired on the spot. Inside, she found not just the one girl, but 3 others. They were all young, all trapped, their eyes holding the same vacant, hopeless look. Alma spoke to them in hushed whispers when the madam was not looking, not with promises of escape, but with a simple, shared understanding of their plight. She was one of them. She planted a seed of hope in the barren soil of their despair. Meanwhile, Jesse moved through the shadows. He located the back room where the girls were kept at night, a single, heavily barred door its only exit. He studied the patrols of the single, lumbering guard who watched the back alley. He loosened the hinges on the stable door behind the saloon. He was a predator in his element, but this time he was hunting for life, not death. The next night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they put their plan into action. Alma started a fire in a trash bin in the kitchen, filling the back of the saloon with thick, acrid smoke. As chaos erupted and the drunken patrons stumbled out the front, Jesse dealt with the guard in the back alley. A single, precise blow to the back of the head with the butt of his Colt. He didn't kill him, just put him to sleep. Alma unbarred the door to the back room and led the 4 terrified girls out into the alley. "He is here to help us," Alma said, her voice a calm anchor in their sea of panic. They fled to the stable, where Jesse had their horses and Cinder waiting. As they were mounting up, the saloon doors burst open. Sheriff Elias Croft stood there, a shotgun in his hands, his face contorted with rage.
"Going somewhere?"
he snarled. A crowd of angry townsfolk began to gather behind him, their faces illuminated by the light from the burning kitchen. Jesse pushed the women behind him. "This has nothing to do with them," he said, his voice ringing out in the night. "This is between you and me."
"You are a thief and a meddler," the sheriff roared. "In redemption, we deal with your kind."
Jesse stepped forward into the light, his hands held away from his sides. He was not wearing his gun belt. It was a gesture of peace, but also of supreme confidence. "Your brother runs a slave market in the middle of your town, Sheriff," Jesse said, his voice calm and clear. "He preys on the weak and the desperate. This town is not a place of redemption. It is a place of rot, and you are the one who lets it fester." The sheriff raised the shotgun.
"You are a dead man."
"Maybe," Jesse said, "but killing me will not make you clean." From the shadows of the stable, Alma raised her rifle. The metallic click as she cocked the hammer was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. The sheriff's eyes flickered toward the sound, his confidence wavering. He was a bully, not a hero. He had a shotgun, but he was facing two people who had looked death in the face and had not flinched. Slowly, Jesse walked toward the sheriff. He stopped just out of arm's reach. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then, Jesse did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single bullet, and dropped it on the ground at the sheriff's feet. "This is mercy," Jesse said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried to every person in the crowd. "It is more than you or your brother deserve. Let us ride out, and you will never see us again. Try to stop us, and I promise you, this town will earn its name." He turned his back on the sheriff, a profound act of trust and defiance, and walked back to the stable. He mounted Cinder, and with Alma at his side and the 4 rescued women trailing behind them, they rode out of redemption, leaving the sheriff, the bullet, and the stunned crowd behind them. They became a small, makeshift caravan, a fragile start to a new kind of family. The rescued women were quiet at first, ghosts haunted by their pasts. But under Alma's quiet guidance, they began to heal. They learned to ride, to shoot, to depend on each other. A young woman named Clara, the girl with the corn silk hair, even began to smile again. One evening, as they made camp in a high meadow filled with wildflowers, Jesse turned to Alma. "We do not need a preacher," he said. "We do not need a town or a church. We only need this." He gestured to the vast, open sky, the tall pine trees that stood like silent witnesses. He took her hand. He had no ring, nothing to offer her but his own broken, healing heart. He told her that he had been dead for 5 years, a walking ghost, and that she had brought him back to life. He promised to spend the rest of his days being a man worth saving. Alma looked at him, her stormy eyes soft with tears. She told him that she had been a prisoner, not just in wagons and cellars, but in her own skin, and that he had given her back the key. She promised to be his heaven, his sanctuary, his home. And there, under the pines, with a bouquet of wildflowers in her hand and the wind as their witness, they married themselves, their vows a quiet, sacred promise whispered into the vastness of the wilderness. That night, they lay together under the stars. There was no fear, no hesitation, no ghosts of the past standing between them. When he touched her, it was with a reverence that bordered on worship. When she touched him, it was with a fierce, possessive love that claimed him completely. They made love slowly, wordlessly, a silent conversation of 2 souls finally finding their way home. It was not a bargain, not a debt, not a sin. It was a choice, a celebration, a beginning. Afterward, as they lay curled together, her head resting on his chest, She spoke, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness.
"Jesse,"
she said, "I think I might be pregnant." He went perfectly still. The world seemed to stop spinning. He stared up at the indifferent stars, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him. It was not fear, it was something far bigger, something that encompassed the terror of the future, the weight of his past, and a sudden, violent, overwhelming surge of pure, unadulterated joy. A child, a new life, a future he had never dared to dream of. He looked down at her beautiful, strong face, and a feeling he had thought long dead bloomed in his chest. A smile spread across his face. Not the grim, tight-lipped expression he usually wore, but a real smile, a true smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled their corners, that remade his entire face, washing away the years of pain and sorrow. It was the smile of a man who had fought his way through hell and had, at long last, found a reason to believe in heaven. They found their valley. It was a place the mapmakers had forgotten, a slash of impossible green tucked away in the granite fists of the mountains. A clear, cold creek cut through a meadow thick with wild timothy and lupine, and the slopes were forested with ponderosa pine and aspen that trembled in the wind, their leaves like 1,000 golden coins. Here, the world was quiet, the air clean. The ghosts of the past held at bay by the sheer, imposing beauty of the landscape. They built their life from the ground up, with their own hands. With the help of the 4 women, Clara, Martha, Susan, and Lila, they raised a cabin near the creek. The logs chinked with mud and moss, the hearth built from river stones. It was not a fortress, but a home. The women, once silent and skittish as deer, slowly began to find their voices again in the safety of the valley. Jesse taught them all to shoot, to track, to read the signs of the land. He taught them not just to survive, but to be strong. Alma taught them something else. She taught them to hope. She would sit with them in the evenings, mending clothes by the firelight, and she would listen. She listened to their stories of pain and loss, and in return, she offered them her own, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A fragile, unconventional family took root in the rich soil of the valley. Jesse watched Alma as the months passed, a sense of awe growing in him daily. Her body changed, swelling with the new life she carried, and with it, her spirit seemed to expand. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a soft, steady glow. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a creator, a life-giver. He would often find his hand resting on her stomach, feeling the faint, fluttering kicks from within, and a fierce, terrifying wave of love would wash over him, so powerful it felt like it could shatter his newly mended ribs. He had something more than his own life to protect now. He had a future. But peace, in that hard country, was a fleeting thing, a shallow-rooted flower that could be torn from the earth by the slightest storm. The seeds of that storm were sown by Lila. She was the quietest of the women, her smiles rare and fleeting. The horrors she had endured had left deeper, more twisted scars on her soul than on the others. She could not, or would not, let go of the bitterness. She saw the love between Jesse and Alma, the growing strength in Clara and the others, and she felt not a sense of belonging, but of exclusion. She did not believe in heaven, on earth or anywhere else. She only believed in the cold, hard currency of survival. One day, on a trip to a mining camp a day's ride away to trade pelts for salt and flour, she saw it, an old, tattered wanted poster, the name Jesse Callahan still visible. The $500 reward, a stark, brutal promise. To the others, it was a reminder of the danger they had escaped. To Lila, it was a temptation. $500. It was not just money. It was an escape, a ticket to a new life, a life far away from the mountains, from the memories, from the fragile family that she felt she would never truly be a part of. The betrayal was not a sudden act, but a slow, creeping poison in her mind. A week later, feigning a need for medicine, she rode out of the valley. She did not come back. Jesse knew, the moment she failed to return, that something was wrong. His instincts, dulled by months of peace, screamed back to life. He posted Clara and Martha as lookouts on the high ridges overlooking the only pass into the valley. He checked his weapons, his face a grim mask. Alma watched him, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her own face pale but resolute. They had been fools to believe their past was truly buried. The bounty hunters came 3 days later. At dawn, there were 6 of them. Hard men with cold eyes, moving with a quiet, professional confidence that made Jesse's blood run cold. They were not the drunken posse from Perdition Gulch. These were predators. Lila had led them right to the door. Clara's warning shot from the ridge was the only signal they got. The first volley of rifle fire from the bounty hunters tore through the thin walls of the cabin, shattering the quiet morning. "Get down!" Jesse roared, shoving Alma toward the heavy wooden table he had built. He grabbed his rifle and his Colt, his mind a cold, clear machine of tactics and angles. He had built this cabin. He knew its strengths, its weaknesses. He fought like a demon. He was no longer the lone avenger seeking to balance a scale. He was a husband and a father, a cornered wolf defending his den. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. He was not fighting to die, he was fighting to live. He dropped the first man who broke from the cover of the trees with a clean shot to the chest. He pinned the others down with a steady, accurate fire, making them believe they were facing more than one man. But they were professionals. They spread out, flanking the cabin, their bullets chewing the log walls to splinters. A shot tore through Jesse's thigh, sending a jolt of agony up his leg. He gritted his teeth, tying a strip of cloth from his shirt around the wound, his hands slick with his own blood. The back door burst open. Alma stood there, a rifle in her hands, her face a mask of fierce determination. She was no longer the girl in chains. She was no longer the trembling survivor in a dust storm. She was fire and resolve, a woman with everything to lose and the will to protect it. She laid down a covering fire from the doorway, her shots true, forcing 2 of the bounty hunters back into the trees. "I am with you, Jesse!" she screamed over the din of the gunfire. "To the end!" He felt a surge of pride and terror. He had never wanted this for her, this world of blood and violence. But seeing her there, fighting by his side, her own woman, her own warrior, he knew that their fates were truly, irrevocably intertwined. The fight raged on, a brutal, desperate ballet of death. A bounty hunter made a charge for the cabin, and Jesse met him halfway, his Colt bucking in his hand, but another man had circled around. A rifle cracked from the trees, and Jesse felt a sledgehammer blow to his chest. The world went white, then gray. He staggered backward, his rifle slipping from his fingers, a look of profound shock on his face. He fell to his knees, his hand coming up to his chest, where a dark, wet stain was rapidly spreading.
"Jesse!"
Alma's scream was a sound of pure, soul-shattering agony. She dropped her rifle and ran to him, throwing herself over his body as he collapsed to the ground. She shielded him with her own body, a fierce, protective shield against the bullets that were still thudding into the dirt around them. The leader of the bounty hunters, a tall man with a cruel, scarred face, stepped out from the trees, his rifle aimed at Alma's back.
"Get away from him, woman," he ordered. "He is ours. The bounty is for him, dead or alive. It makes no difference to us."
Alma twisted around, her face a mess of tears and fury. She glared up at the man, her eyes burning with a righteous hatred.
"You will not touch him!"
she shrieked, her voice raw with grief.
"You think he is just a name on a piece of paper? A monster? You are the monsters. This man saved us. He saved us all from men like you. He is a better man than you will ever be."
The bounty hunter sneered, raising his rifle, But before he could fire, a shot rang out from the ridge. The man grunted, a red hole appearing in his shoulder, and he stumbled back. It was Clara. She and Martha, seeing Jesse fall, had abandoned their posts and were now charging down the slope, firing as they came. The remaining bounty hunters, their leader wounded and their confidence shattered by the sudden, fierce assault from a handful of women they had dismissed as easy prey, broke and ran. They scrambled for their horses and fled the valley, leaving their dead behind. The silence that fell was more deafening than the gunfire. Alma turned back to Jesse, her hands pressing desperately against the wound in his chest.
"Jesse, stay with me,"
she sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale, still face.
"You cannot leave me. You cannot leave us."
He survived, by a miracle of will, of Alma's desperate nursing, of a constitution forged in hardship. He survived, but it was a near thing. For weeks, he hovered in the gray twilight between life and death, his breath shallow, his body consumed by fever. Alma never left his side. She, Clara, and Susan. Martha had been killed in the final charge, a casualty of their victory, tended to his wounds, their grief for their fallen friend fueling their determination to save their protector. They buried Martha in the meadow, under a tall pine tree. They rebuilt the bullet-riddled sections of the cabin. They planted wildflowers on Martha's grave, a splash of vibrant color in the somber green of the valley. And slowly, day by day, breath by breath, Alma nursed Jesse back to life. Again. Months passed. The brutal heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The aspen trees on the slopes turned a brilliant yellow, and the first dusting of snow appeared on the high peaks. The valley healed, and so did Jesse. His body was a roadmap of scars now, a testament to the wars he had fought, both inside and out. But his eyes were clear, the ghosts finally laid to rest. One cool evening, Jesse stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. In his arms, he held a small, sleeping bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. His daughter, Dawn. She had been born a week ago, a healthy, beautiful child with a tuft of dark hair and her mother's stormy eyes. He looked down at her tiny, perfect face, and he felt a love so profound, so complete, that it filled all the empty, broken places inside him. He felt Alma come to stand beside him, her warmth a familiar comfort. She leaned her head on his good shoulder, her hand resting on his arm, and together they watched their daughter sleep. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing the soft down on the baby's head. He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that was too deep for words. "Your mama saved me," he said, his voice a quiet promise meant only for the two of them. "And now I have got to be the kind of man worth saving." He looked at Alma then, and she was smiling, her eyes shining with tears. He looked out at the sunset, at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous world that lay beyond their small sanctuary. The scars remained, on his body and on his soul. The memories would never fade completely, but for the first time, they were not a weight that threatened to pull him under. They were a part of him, a part of the long, hard road that had led him here, to this moment, to this woman, to this child, to this peace. He had fought his way through a hell of his own making. He had clawed his way through a darkness that had almost consumed him. And now, at long last, as he stood there with his family, with the woman who was his anchor, his partner, his home, he finally believed her words were true. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know where you are tuning in from to connect with fellow listeners. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.